Everyone is telling you that XRP will replace banks and change entire payment structure the world is using. But no one answers one simple question. Why financial institutions even care about XRP? What makes it special and different than any other cryptocurrency out there? Welcome to the XRP Club, a place where we answer these questions in simplest possible language so even complete crypto beginners can understand. Now let's start by answering very first question. What institutions actually need from digital asset? To understand why financial institutions care about XRP at all, it helps to start from the opposite direction. Institutions don't begin by asking which crypto asset has the loudest community, the biggest price predictions, or the strongest social media narrative. They begin by asking whether a digital asset solves a real operational problem. For banks, payment companies, and large financial firms, that usually means 5 things: speed, liquidity, efficiency, reliability, and compliance. If a digital asset cannot improve at least some of those areas, then there is very little reason for a serious institution to care about it. Ripple's own enterprise materials frame the problem in similar terms, focusing on faster cross-border transfers, better liquidity access, and less capital tied up in destination accounts. Speed matters because institutions move large amounts of value across different countries, currencies, and time zones. In traditional finance, that process can involve multiple intermediaries, bank cutoff hours, delayed settlement, and operational friction. Liquidity matters because institutions often need money available in the right place before a payment can even happen. Research from the Bank for International Settlements has highlighted trapped liquidity and foreign exchange liquidity as major cost drivers in cross-border payments. In other words, institutions are not just paying for the transfer itself, they are also paying for the inefficiency around the transfer. That is the context in which XRP starts to matter. Official XRPL documentation states that XRP was created in 2012 specifically for payments and can settle transactions on the ledger in about 3 to 5 seconds. The XRP ledger's consensus process is also designed to close new ledger versions in only a few seconds, which is very different from systems that require longer confirmation times or depend on more layered settlement processes. This does not automatically mean every institution will choose XRP, but it does explain why XRP entered the conversation in the first place. It was designed around a payments use case from the beginning, not added later as a marketing story. That matters because many crypto assets were not built with institutional payments in mind. Some were designed mainly as stores of value. Others were built around smart contracts, decentralized applications, or speculative trading ecosystems. XRP's core proposition has always been narrower and more practical. The idea is not that institutions need another volatile asset for speculation. The idea is that they may care about a digital asset if it helps move value quickly, unlock liquidity, and reduce operational friction in a system where time, capital, and reliability directly affect cost. That is the lens through which the rest of this topic needs to be understood. Now that was the broad explanation, but now we dive deeper, because second topic will explain how XRP solves one of the biggest problems institutions face today, and those are cross-border payments. Cross-border payments are one of the least efficient parts of modern finance. Sending money from one country to another often sounds simple from the customer side, but behind the scenes, it usually involves multiple banks, payment providers, foreign exchange conversions, compliance checks, cutoff times, and settlement delays. Ripple describes traditional cross-border payments as a process that often moves through a chain of correspondent banks, with institutions needing to deposit capital in destination accounts before funds can move across currencies and jurisdictions. That means the payment is not only a transfer problem, it is also a coordination problem. In many cases, a bank or payment company cannot just decide to move money instantly across the world. It may need money already sitting in the destination market, or access to foreign exchange liquidity at the right time and price. The Bank for International Settlements has pointed out that sourcing liquidity carries costs and risks, and that liquidity bridges can reduce liquidity costs and release trapped liquidity. That point matters because trapped capital is not a small operational detail. For a large institution, capital sitting idle in multiple jurisdictions is expensive, inefficient, and difficult to scale globally. There is also a broader structural issue. The Financial Stability Board has reported that the number of correspondent banks fell by 22% between 2011 and 2019, even as the value of payments increased. That matters because correspondent banking is still one of the key mechanisms behind cross-border transfers. When those relationships shrink, the system can become more fragmented, less accessible, and more expensive, especially in certain corridors. That is where XRP's design starts to make sense. As we already said in previous topic, XRP was created specifically for payments and can settle transactions on the ledger in 3 to 5 seconds. Ripple's payments materials describe a model where traditional currency can be converted into a digital asset such as XRP, moved across the blockchain in seconds, and then converted into the destination currency. Instead of keeping large amounts of money parked around the world ahead of time, an institution may be able to source liquidity when needed and settle much faster. So when people ask why institutions would even look at XRP, this is the starting answer. They are not looking for another speculative coin. They are looking at whether a digital asset can reduce delay, reduce trapped capital, improve liquidity access, and make cross-border movement of value more operationally efficient. And that is the problem XRP was built to address. Now, we did mention that XRP can serve as a bridge asset, but let's dive a bit deeper and explain how that actually works and what problem it solves. The simplest way to understand XRP's bridge role is to stop thinking about it as a final destination and start thinking about it as a connector. In traditional finance, money often has to move through several separate steps before it reaches the other side. As we already said in previous topic, one currency may need to be exchanged into another, liquidity may need to be sourced from different providers, and the institution sending the payment may need to rely on accounts or intermediaries already positioned in the right market. That structure works, but it is slow, expensive, and operationally heavy. A bridge asset is meant to simplify that path. Instead of trying to find a direct market between every possible currency pair, an institution can use one intermediary asset that sits in the middle. The process, in simple terms, is that one currency is converted into the bridge asset, that asset is transferred, and then it is converted into the destination currency. Ripple's materials have long described XRP in exactly that role, as a real-time liquidity bridge between sending and receiving currencies. The reason that matters is not because XRP is magical. It matters because a single intermediary can be more efficient than maintaining many separate liquidity relationships for every corridor. This is also where XRP differs from many other crypto assets. Its institutional case is not mainly based on being held as digital property or used as a platform token for applications. Its main financial use case has always been tied to movement of value. That gives it a practical role in a bridge model because speed only matters if the asset can move quickly enough to reduce the time and capital exposure involved in the transfer. There is another important layer here. On the XRP ledger itself, XRP can also serve as an intermediary between other assets through auto-bridging. XRPL documentation explains that auto-bridging improves liquidity across asset pairs by using XRP as an intermediary when that route is cheaper than trading directly. In plain language, that means XRP can help connect markets that do not have strong direct liquidity with each other. So the bridge idea is not only about cross-border payments between banks or payment firms. It also exists inside the ledger's own market structure. That does not mean every international payment today is flowing through XRP, and it does not prove that institutions are already using it at global scale. But few things are pretty clear. XRP was designed to function as a bridge asset, and both Ripple's payment model and XRPL's own exchange mechanics give it a real reason to be evaluated in that role. Viewed that way, institutions do not need to believe XRP will replace the whole banking system. They only need to see that it may reduce friction between one side of a transaction and the other. All right, so far the focus has been on payments, But that is no longer the only reason institutions may look at the XRP ledger. Another major reason is tokenization. In simple terms, tokenization means turning ownership rights in a real-world asset into digital tokens that can be issued, tracked, and transferred on blockchain infrastructure. For financial institutions, that matters because many traditional assets are slow to move, costly to manage, and difficult to divide or trade efficiently. Tokenization offers a way to make those assets easier to issue, easier to transfer, and in some cases, easier to access. XRPL's own materials now place real-world asset tokenization among the network's core institutional use cases. This is important because institutions do not always enter blockchain through payments first. In many cases, they enter through asset infrastructure. They may care about tokenized property, commodities, private credit, funds, or stablecoins before they care about using XRP directly as a bridge asset. That does not make XRP irrelevant. It changes the order of interest. First comes a question of whether the ledger can support serious financial assets. Then comes a question of what role XRP may play inside that environment. That shift became much easier to see in 2026. On February 20th, 2026, Control-Alt and the Dubai Land Department announced Phase 2 of Dubai's real estate tokenization pilot. According to Control-Alt, 10 properties had already been tokenized in the pilot stage, representing more than 18.5 million, or over $5 million in real estate value. Around 7.8 million tokens became eligible for resale in a controlled secondary market. And Control-Alt stated that all on-chain transactions in this phase will continue to be executed on the XRP ledger and secured by Ripple custody. That is not a theory about what tokenization might become. It is a live example of regulated property infrastructure being built on XRPL. There was also a separate 2026 example in commodities. CoinDesk reported on February 3rd, 2026, that Billiton Diamond and Control-Alt had moved about $280 million in certified polished diamonds on-chain in the UAE using the XRP ledger and Ripple's custody infrastructure. Ripple's Reese Merrick publicly described the initiative as support for tokenizing high-value physical assets on XRPL. That matters because it shows the ledger being used not only for value transfer, but for the digital representation of ownership in real-world goods. And institutions may not look at XRP only because they want a faster payment asset. They may also care because XRPL is being used as infrastructure for tokenized finance. And once tokenized assets begin settling, transferring, and trading on that infrastructure, XRP becomes part of a much bigger institutional conversation than payments alone. All right, we looked at tokenization projects being built on the XRP ledger, but that leads to another important question. If institutions start using XRPL for tokenized property, diamonds, stablecoins, or other real-world assets, where does XRP itself fit into that system? The answer is that XRP is not just one more asset on the ledger. It is the ledger's native asset, which means it plays a built-in operational role that other issued tokens do not. According to XRPL documentation, XRP serves to protect the ledger from spam, pays transaction costs, and can bridge currencies in the decentralized exchange when that is useful to users. That is important simply because institutions don't only care about whether an asset can be tokenized. They also care about the infrastructure underneath that asset. If tokenized property or commodities are moving on XRPL, every on-chain action still depends on the network functioning reliably. XRP is part of that function. Standard transactions on XRPL require a very small fee paid in XRP, and that fee is not given to a validator in the way many people assume from other blockchains. XRPL documentation states that the current minimum cost for a standard transaction is 0.00001 XRP, and those fees are meant mainly to protect the network from spam and abuse. In other words, XRP is part of the ledger's internal operating logic, not just a separate investment instrument sitting on top of it. There is also the reserve system. On XRPL, an account must hold a base reserve in XRP. The current mainnet reserve is 1 XRP per account. plus 0.2 XRP for each additional owned object. That means the network uses XRP as a built-in economic requirement for maintaining ledger state. This is especially relevant in a tokenization environment because more assets, offers, and on-chain objects can mean more interaction with this reserve structure. So even when the asset being issued is not XRP, the ledger still relies on XRP at the base layer. XRP also remains important because XRPL's market structure is designed around it. As mentioned earlier, the decentralized exchange can use XRP for auto-bridging between assets when that route improves liquidity or pricing. That means tokenized assets do not exist in total isolation from XRP. If more financial assets are issued and traded on XRPL, XRP can still benefit from being the native connector inside that market design. So the key point is not that every tokenized asset on XRPL automatically creates huge direct demand for XRP. The more accurate point is that the more serious activity happens on the ledger, the more relevant XRP remains to the ledger's basic operation, liquidity routing, and network structure, which at great enough scale will drive that demand. And now we reach the point where XRP is no longer just about speed, liquidity, or tokenization. For financial institutions, there is another condition that matters just as much as all of those things, and that is legal and compliance structure. A bank, payments company, or regulated financial firm cannot build serious products around an asset or a blockchain network unless it can understand the rules that apply to it. That includes who can access the market, how counterparties are vetted, how risk is controlled, and whether the legal treatment of the asset is at least clear enough to support planning. This is one of the biggest reasons institutions look far more carefully at XRP and XRPL than many people realize. The question is not only whether the technology works. The question is whether it can operate inside a framework institutions can actually use. Open blockchain systems and institutional finance do not always fit together easily. Institutions usually need identity checks, access controls, auditability, and clear rules around who can trade or interact with whom. XRPL's newer, compliance-focused features are meant to address that gap. Permission domains allow access to be restricted based on accepted credentials, and permission DEX environments allow regulated businesses to trade on XRPL while limiting activity to vetted participants. Ripple has explicitly positioned these features as part of a compliance-first path toward institutional DeFi and on-chain finance. In simple terms, institutions are much more likely to care about blockchain infrastructure when it starts to look less like an anonymous free-for-all and more like a controlled financial environment with rules. Legal clarity matters just as much. Ripple's SEC case became one of the most important legal battles in crypto because it forced the market to confront what parts of XRP activity the SEC could and could not treat as securities activity. Judge Torres held that Ripple's institutional sales violated securities law registration requirements, but programmatic sales on exchanges did not receive the same treatment. In August 2024, the court entered final judgment and imposed a $125 million civil penalty tied to the institutional sales part of the case. Then, in August 2025, the SEC and Ripple dismissed their appeals, which left those rulings in place. That does not mean XRP receives some universal official label that resolves every legal question forever, but it does mean Ripple emerged from the case with more judicial clarity than most crypto firms ever obtained through litigation. So the real advantage here is not that all uncertainty disappeared. It is that Ripple and the XRP ecosystem spent years forcing clearer boundaries into the discussion, while XRPL continued building features specifically aimed at institutional compliance. For institutions, that combination matters. Many have this technology, but compliance structure and legal clarity are usually what determine whether anyone serious walks through it. And now, since you made it this far through the video, I will explain probably the biggest mistake people make around this topic, and that is assuming that institutional interest in XRP means institutions are rushing in to buy and hold massive amounts of XRP directly. That is not how serious financial adoption usually works. Institutions first look at function. They look at whether a network can support payments, liquidity access, tokenization, compliance controls, and reliable settlement. Only after that do they look at what role the native asset plays inside that system. So when people hear that a bank, payments firm, or infrastructure provider is working with Ripple or building on the XRP ledger, it does not automatically mean that institution is making a huge direct bet on XRP itself. That confusion happens partly because Ripple, XRP, and XRPL are often treated like they are the same thing when they are not. A company may use Ripple's technology without using XRP in every transaction. A project may build on XRPL because it wants tokenization infrastructure, custody support, or on-chain settlement features, without that meaning XRP suddenly becomes the center of the entire business model. As we already mentioned in previous topics, XRP can still matter in those systems because it is the native asset of the ledger, supports fees, reserves, and routing, but that is different from saying every partnership creates immediate buy pressure on the token. Those are two very different claims. Another common mistake is the idea that if tokenization grows on XRPL, then XRP price must automatically explode. Tokenized assets can increase the relevance of the ledger, and they can strengthen the case for XRP as part of the network structure. But the path from ecosystem growth to token demand is not automatic or immediate. It depends on how assets are issued, how liquidity is routed, how much activity happens on chain, and whether XRP is being used in meaningful parts of that activity. The broader point is that utility can grow faster than price, at least for a period of time. People also misunderstand what institutional interest actually means. It does not mean banks want XRP to replace banks. In most cases, institutions are not looking for a system that destroys their role. They are looking for infrastructure that makes parts of their existing role more efficient. Faster settlement, better liquidity management, clearer compliance controls, and more flexible asset infrastructure are realistic reasons to care. The idea that institutions are lining up because they want to abandon the entire financial system overnight is mostly clickbait storytelling. So the cleanest way to understand institutional interest is this. It is real, but it is often narrower and more operational than social media makes it sound. That does not weaken the case for XRP. It actually makes the case more credible because real adoption usually grows through infrastructure, not through fake, hyped up headlines. And with that, you now have a much clearer picture of why financial institutions care about XRP, what role it can play in payments and liquidity, how tokenization expands that picture, and where the real limits of the story still are. To keep educating yourself about XRP, you can watch one of the 2 videos that appeared on your screen now. If you think this video helped, you can also subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.